Welcome to lecture number 98. This is the final lecture for period 8. The topic is Continuity and Change in Period 8. The learning objective says, explain the extent to which the events of the period from 1945 to 1980 reshaped national identity. The first key concept says, the United States responded to an uncertain and unstable post-war world by asserting and working to maintain a position of global leadership with far-reaching domestic and international consequences. This key concept covers the foreign policy of the U.S. in the period. The continuity in this period is that the U.S. emerged from another world war as a dominant world power. This is partly due to being on the winning side of the war and none of the fighting happening in the U.S. In both world wars, the U.S. allied with the Western European countries, Britain and France, but also with the Soviet Union. The change in this historical period is that the U.S. stepped into the leadership role at the end of the war as opposed to receding into isolationism as it did following World War I. Post-World War I, the U.S. rejected the Treaty of Versailles and did not join the League of Nations. This time around, the United States co-founded the UN, the NATO alliance, and implemented the Marshall Plan. They also formed financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. All of this was for the purpose of keeping communism from taking hold in Europe. The U.S. also involved themselves in hot wars like Vietnam and Korea to try and keep communism from spreading in other parts of Asia. The second key concept says United States policymakers engaged in a Cold War with the authoritarian Soviet Union, seeking to limit the growth of communist military power and ideological influence, create a free market global economy, and build an international security system. The United States always had an aversion towards communism. The first Red Scare after the First World War fueled nativist sentiment that resulted in restrictive immigration policy. The change is that the U.S. expanded its communist activities to its foreign policy. In the second Red Scare after World War II, the United States took on an aggressive foreign policy that treated the Soviet Union as an aggressive power. The U.S., no longer an isolationist country, now would try to stop the spread of communism around the world instead of just trying to stop it from reaching the U.S. This is influenced by George Kennan's Long Telegram, which said that the Soviet Union would only respond to strong decisive actions by the U.S. It created a rivalry between East and West. Western European countries and the U.S. were part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact that consisted of Eastern European countries. The next key concept says Cold War policies led to public debates over the power of the federal government and acceptable means for pursuing international and domestic goals while protecting civil liberties. Civil liberties in a time of war had been debated before in World War I and World War II. During World War I, the government passed the Sedition Act, which was challenged in the Supreme Court. The court upheld that free speech may be restricted in times in which it presents a clear and present danger. During World War II, Japanese imprisonment in the U.S. was a form of martial law in which the rights of habeas corpus were suspended for anyone of Japanese ancestry. Again, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government's action that curtailed civil liberties. In this historical period, people's freedom of speech and freedom of association are limited through policies that are meant to root out domestic communist threats. The change in this period is that the Red Scare is more visible and impactful in people's everyday lives to the point that it infringes on people's civil liberties. The paranoia hit such a height that anyone who wasn't overly patriotic and anti-communist could be suspected of supporting communism. It's taken to a new level under Senator McCarthy, so much so that this era of paranoia over communism is often referred to as McCarthyism. Legislation like the Smith Act made it illegal to have joined the Communist Party, and executive orders implemented loyalty oaths. Blacklisting became a common practice in Hollywood to make sure that people who had ties to communism weren't able to get jobs in the film industry. The House Un-American Activities Committee interrogated suspected spies and actually uncovered actual cases of espionage like Alger Hiss and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. These confirmed cases of communist espionage inside of the United States made the paranoia even worse. The next key concept says, new movements for civil rights and liberal efforts to expand the role of government generated a range of political and cultural responses. The main continuity is that the civil rights movement went back to the 19th century after Reconstruction ended. Jim Crow laws were passed across the South, and African American civil rights leaders tried to combat the segregation and discrimination. The court case Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 made these state laws constitutional. Voting rights were also infringed upon throughout the South through literacy tests and poll taxes, while whites were exempt from those laws through grandfather clauses. The change in this historical period is that the civil rights movement started to use nonviolent resistance, boycotts, and peaceful protests. Examples include the Montgomery bus boycott, the lunch counter sit-ins, wade-ins, and freedom rides. Their efforts inspired legislative victories when peaceful protesters were shown to be abused and harassed on television. Examples of these are the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the ratification of the 24th Amendment, which eliminated the poll tax. The next key concept says, seeking to fulfill Reconstruction-era promises, civil rights activists and political leaders achieved some legal and political success in ending segregation, although progress towards racial equality was slow. The continuity is that government had implemented some previous policies to end discrimination in previous periods. The Executive Order 8802 was put in place to end segregation in the defense industries during World War II, but it was nothing close to what was able to be done under Johnson's Great Society programs. Major changes came about when the Supreme Court ruled on the side of the civil rights movement in various major cases. In Brown v. the Board of Education and the Heart of Atlanta Motel v. the United States, they ended segregation in schools and any institution engaged in interstate commerce. Congress also passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act and later on the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act created an enforcement apparatus to ensure African Americans didn't have their right to vote infringed upon, exactly 95 years after the 15th Amendment granted them that right. The next key concept says, responding to social conditions in the African American civil rights movement, a variety of movements emerged that focused on issues of identity, social justice, and the environment. The continuity here is that historically disadvantaged groups were still disadvantaged from 1945 to 1980. This doesn't just refer to African Americans, but now it also includes LGBT, Latinos, and women. Additionally, the U.S. had been conscious of their impact on the environment in earlier periods with the conservation and preservation debates in the early 1900s. The change in this period is that previously disadvantaged groups started to use the same strategies and methods that the civil rights movement used to end discriminatory practices. One of the sparks for this was the Stonewall riots for the gay and lesbian movement in 1969, the printing of the feminine mystique for the women's movement in 1963, and sit-ins were taken to a whole new level when American Indians occupied Alcatraz Island for 19 months. The United Farm Workers used unionized laborers and boycotts to try and end exploitation and discrimination against Latinos in agricultural work. They were successful at eventually winning collective bargaining rights in California in 1975. Finally, Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring brought attention to the negative impacts of synthetic pesticides and influenced government to ban their use. This was quite similar to the old muckraking of the Progressive era. The next key concept says, liberalism influenced post-war politics and court decisions, but it came under increasing attack from the left as well as from a resurgent conservative movement. Liberalism is the idea that there are problems so large that only government has the power and the means to fix those problems. It had been widely accepted by Americans as a result of the Great Depression and the New Deal. However, this changes, especially in the 1970s. Social conservatives criticized Supreme Court decisions like Miranda v. Arizona and Roe v. Wade. They thought that the government was making bad decisions and that they were taking on too much of an activist docket. There was growing skepticism to the powers of the government and whether or not the government should have as much power as it did. Americans thought that those powers were even less justified if the government couldn't cope with large economic problems like the stagflation that resulted from the 1973 oil embargo. After the Watergate scandal, when the president had been found out to have been lying about his involvement in the Watergate break-in, Americans lost even more confidence in their government. There were also criticisms of liberalism from the left, as the key concept suggests. The Weather Underground was a group that got fed up and sought faster changes from the government, so therefore adopted violence as a way to voice their discontent. The next key concept says, post-war economic and demographic changes had far-reaching consequences for American society, politics, and culture. The continuity is that after World War I, there was a prolonged economic expansion in the United States through the 1920s. There was an accumulation of wealth both after World War I and after World War II at disproportionate levels. The United States still had a racial wealth problem. White families were more often able to buy homes in nice neighborhoods, in the suburbs like in Levittowns, and because of discriminatory practices like redlining, restrictive covenants, or discrimination in lending, African American families were not able to build that same wealth through this era. The baby boom is the biggest demographic change. It's a rise in birth rates that's starting after 1945. This new generation came of age in the midst of post-war prosperity, but also during uncertain periods of war and civil rights demonstrations. At the same time they're coming of age, more Americans were moving to the suburbs and to the Sunbelt of the United States. The younger generation in this period was more active in anti-war protests and civil rights protests. Hippie counterculture formed in their resistance to conform to the lifestyles or to the paths of their parents. The second to last key concept says, rapid economic and social changes in American society fostered a sense of optimism in the post-war years. The United States was in the strongest economic position after World War II, just like it was in the strongest economic position after World War I. The policy proposals of Kennedy and Johnson, the New Frontier and the Great Society, respectively, epitomized this optimism. Kennedy took this optimism and promised to put American astronauts on the moon surface by the end of the decade. LBJ declared a war on poverty, and he thought that government could solve all of society's ills, whether they be economic, racial, or related to foreign policy. However, once other countries recovered from the devastation of the war, the United States encountered more economic competition. The worst economic recession of the period was caused by the OPEC oil embargo. Because of the simultaneous rise in prices, it creates stagflation. That means that unemployment was high, with rising inflation making conditions worse. The government's response was to try and fix inflation first, but it made the unemployment problem even worse. The final key concept says, new demographic and social developments, along with anxieties over the Cold War, changed U.S. culture and led to significant political and moral debates that sharply divided the nation. Divisive issues were not new for the U.S. Issues of civil rights, foreign policy, the role of government in the economy and in people's lives had caused disagreements in the past. These debates continued from 1945 to 1980. During the Gilded Age, the role of the federal government in the economy became a point of contention. Civil rights and racial discrimination issues went back to the end of Reconstruction and the adoption of Jim Crow laws. The debate on the U.S.'s role in the world was also not new, as it began to divide people in the U.S. in the era of imperialism at the turn of the century. What's different through this period is that the U.S. was more active in upholding civil rights. That creates a backlash against programs that were meant to create a more equitable system like affirmative action. Riots occurred through the 1960s as racial tensions in large American cities reached the boiling point. The most widespread riots happened after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Those who watched the riots unfold were alienated further from the goals of the civil rights movement. The United States continued to support their allies abroad, but was now more active in containing communism to the point that it verged on brinksmanship. Even this policy goes through an evolution in the period when détente was used as an attempt to ease tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. The Nixon administration took it further and employed Vietnamization as the exit strategy to the Vietnam War. American troops would come back home and South Vietnamese troops would take the place of those American troops, while the US continued to send supplies and aid to resist communism. Finally, there was a backlash against the economic regulations that were put in place thanks to the growing environmental movement. In their effort to protect certain endangered species or the purity of America's air and water, businesses complained that their economic opportunities were being limited. Finally, here's the recap. The United States became a global leader in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. That's a change. The US objective during the Cold War was to limit the influence of communism around the world. There is an argument to be made that this is a continuity because of previous aversion to the communism after World War I. The civil rights movement made significant gains, inspiring other historical disadvantaged groups. This is a continuity and a change. The civil rights movement was nothing new, however, the government now was reacting and ending various discriminatory practices. The Supreme Court was active in ensuring civil liberties, which led to the opposition from critics of big government. Another change was that the post-war economic growth and the baby boomers impacted American culture. Finally, the post-war optimism gave way to disillusion over the Vietnam War and Watergate. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture.